Hi, I hope you're okay. Today I want us to go through the communication process. Before even you convince someone to change a behavior, since this unit is on health and human behavior, you have to understand how are you supposed to pass your message to the individual, and how are you supposed to not only pass the message, but how are you supposed to pass the message effectively to be well understood and well accepted by the receiver of the message that you want to pass across. So I want us to go through the communication process, and communication is a cyclic process that do not have any end. We have the sender sending a message through a channel to the receiver, and the receiver giving back the feedback to the original sender with a message, definitely using a channel. That's why I'm saying communication is a continuous process that do not have the end. It's a cyclic thing. So the communication process is a process that is cyclic in nature and also continuous. It is important to mention here that this process is very changing, and this is because the components keep on changing, where the sender can be a receiver. For example, when you send a message to someone, the person who is receiving your message will definitely give you the feedback. So the person who is sending the feedback will now become the sender, and you will become the receiver. So the sender can become the receiver, for example, when giving feedback. So the channel may change in that the sender may write a letter to give you the feedback through the letter, while you use maybe a phone call, or you use the word of mouth to send your message to that person. So, and the receiver responds through a telephone call. So still the channel can also change. So let's go through the components of communication. We have the sender as the first component, and is, as the word suggests, this is the originator or the source of the message. Where for effective communication to take place, the sender must understand well the audience or the receiver, as well as understand the knowledge of the subject. You have to understand your message before you send the message. And also you have to understand who are you sending the message to. You have to understand that person in these aspects. You have to understand the person in terms of age. You have to understand the person in terms of education background. You have to understand this person in terms of language. For example, you can't use casual language. For example, when you're communicating formally, you have to use a formal language. You can't use a language that the receiver won't understand. You can't use, for example, you can't use Kamba language when maybe the receiver is a Kikuyu person. You can't. You have to use a language that this person will understand. The same case when you're communicating to a class 8 student, and when you're communicating to a PP1 student, those are two different levels of personality. So you have to use a language that is well understood by each and every person that you're sending the message to. Another aspect that you are not supposed to consider is social cultural background, and also the sex of the receiver. You have to understand this culture, you have to understand the sex of this person, the gender of this person, in order for you to not to harm, or you not to communicate in a way that you may be harming this person. So this is to enable the sender frame the message to the level of the audience, and to avoid barriers that may exist when you don't understand the receiver. So for a sender have to understand both the message and the receiver of the message. The next component is message, and this is the information or idea intended to be shared. The idea that you want to share to the other person, or the information that you want to share to the other person, is the message. So the message should be clear and simple. If you use ambiguous language, or if you use ambiguous words, if you use a message that is complicated, the receiver will not be able to understand. So this message need to be clear and simple, and it also should have facts and purpose in order to affect the audience. You just don't pass any message. You should pass a message that have both the facts and a purpose that you want to instill in the audience or the receiver. Then we have the channel as the third component, and this is the medium or method used to convey the message from the sender to the receiver. The method or the medium that you want to use in order to give the message to the other person is the channel. And channel should be familiar and accessible to both the sender and the receiver. For example, if you're dealing with an illiterate person, you can't send them a letter. You can't use an email to communicate to them. You have to use a channel that will be able, or they will be able to use as they receive the message. So if you choose to write a message, you should ensure that the audience who receive is literate, are able to read your message. Then there are three channels of communication. We have the verbal, we have the non-verbal, and we have the written. So the verbal communication is the use of spoken words, like I'm communicating to you now. I'm using a verbal communication because you can't see my other my gestures, you can't see my face. You're just listening to what I'm saying because I'm using spoken words to explain the message that I want to portray to you. So this is done through face-to-face. It can either be face-to-face, it can be either telephone conversation, it can also be either radio and television broadcast, it can also be through YouTube channels, etc., where you're using words, you're listening to the words. Then we have another type of channel, the non-verbal communication, and this is communication without words, and mostly it involves body movement, gestures, facial expression, body posture, vocal tones, and touch. You're not using any word. Let me use an example. When a baby is crying, the baby is communicating. Either maybe the baby, the various types of ways through which a child will cry. And there is a type of a cry which will say the child is sick, the child is hungry, the child needs to suckle, the child is tired, needs to take a nap. So those are vocal tones. They are not using words, but they are communicating to you through use of vocal tone. Or the use of these tones will help you understand what they want to pass across. Then we have gestures. We have facial expression. When someone frowns, when someone smiles, they communicate to you. Body posture. There is a way that a person will see it when you're communicating to them, and maybe see the person or understand that person is communicating to that they're bored of what you're telling them, or they're even alert. Their body posture that will communicate to you, or that a person will use to communicate to you. Then nonverbal communication is cultural specific, depending on the culture of each and every individual. The verbal communication may change from one person to the other. It is therefore important for you to learn the non-verbal signs acceptable in the community where you're working. This will help or will enhance your communication skill by helping your clients to understand your message even better. So whenever you go or whenever you interact with people, learn these gestures because they will change depending on the culture of the individuals you are dealing with. So those are the channels of verbal communication. And we have the verbal, we have the non-verbal, and we have the written communication. In written communication, we normally use print media. We can use newspapers, we can use books, we can use letters, we can use posters, we can use memos, etc. It includes electronic media like telegrams, emails, and fax. So written communication, that doesn't mean that you're only dealing with the print media. We also deal with electronic media, where we are using telegrams, we're using emails, we're using fax. So those are the three types of channels that you normally use in communication. Then the next component is the receiver, and this is the recipient, whoever is receiving your message or the person the message is intended for. The recipient is also called the audience. So the mode of the audience, the attitude of the audience towards your message, the language or the level of the education of the audience, the social cultural background of the audience, all determines the reception of the message. So depending on the attitude of the audience, the mood of the audience, the level of education of the audience, the social cultural background of the audience, the language at which or in which they understand or they normally use, will determine how they will receive your message. So it is important that the sender understand the audience in terms of their attitude, in terms of their mood, in terms of their language that they communicate freely, in terms of the education level they use or they have, in terms of the social and cultural background they have. You need to suit your message to be able to communicate well with them. So you have to understand all those aspects before you start communicating with the audience. So before you send a message, you should consider all these aspects for effective communication to take place. Then we have the next component of communication, which is the feedback. And this is the process or response of the audience to the message conveyed from the source. It's the response. So depending on your message, or the feedback will be, the nature of the feedback will determine whether this receiver understood your message or not. So you'll be able to range yourself, or you'll be able to know whether your communication was better or in your message, whether your message was understood by the receiver through the feedback they sent you. So the feedback is used to evaluate the reception of the message. You're able to evaluate how they received your message. Did they understand what your message was supposed to be or was supposed to convey to them or not? So for communication to be termed effective, the feedback should reflect the same meaning as the original message. So the message you send need to have the same meaning, or you need to the feedback need to reflect the same meaning as the message you send to the receiver. So those are the components of communication. We have the sender who sends a message through a channel to a receiver who later sends back the feedback. So I want also us to look at another aspect, noise, which normally interfere with the sending of the message to the receiver. Noise is termed as any interference that reduces So noise is any interference that reduces the clarity of a message. Any interference, either internal, external, or even semantic, that will reduce the clarity of the message that is being sent. So noise can also be termed as interference that keeps the message from being understood or accurately interpreted. For example, if you're absent-minded when someone is communicating to you, person to person, that can also be termed as noise, because it will interfere with your understanding of the message that is being sent to you. So noise occurs between the sender and the receiver and comes in three forms. We have external noise. For example, if we have a lot of people moving around, they will make a lot of noise. So that noise will come to interfere with your understanding. For example, when you're in a class, you might not be able to understand what the lecturer or the teacher is saying because there are some other noises that are around or surrounding you. Then we have internal and we have semantic. Let's go one by one. So external noise is from the environment and keeps the message from being heard or understood. You can be hearing what the lecturer is saying, but because you're disrupted because of the noise surrounding you, you might not understand the message. It can be in the form of sound. It can also be in form of heat, because once you have heat, it makes someone uncomfortable. And when you are uncomfortable, you are not able to concentrate on what the message is.
You are currently the only person in this conference.
So, internal noise, it occurs in the person's mind and consists of thoughts and feelings focused on something else other than the message. We can term this as being absent-minded, where you're thinking of other things. You're not concentrating on what the sender is telling you, or whoever is talking to you is telling you. Then we have another type of noise, which is semantic noise, which occurs as a result of people emotional reactions to words. E.g., when you use words that maybe are not acceptable culturally to the audience, depending on the tribe of the audience, the race of the audience, the gender of the audience, as well as the cultural value of the audience, they may not listen to you because they have emotional interruption. For example, if a woman is talking to a group of men, in where the culture of those men dictates that maybe they should not listen or they should not be instructed by a woman, they might not even concentrate on what the woman is saying, because culturally the woman is supposed to be talking to them as men. So this is semantic noise, which is interruption due to emotional reaction towards the words that you're talking to, or the words that you're using, the race of this audience, the gender of this audience, the cultural values of this audience. For example, when you say the women are smart, where the gender or the women in that group or the audience normally accept the term ladies being used to them and not women, they not even concentrate on what you, because there is that will happen. That is normally known as semantic noise. Noise can not only be the sound that is being created around you. Noise can be in terms of internal noise or external noise, or even semantic noise, which will interfere with the passage of the information or the message to the receiver. Then we have principles of communications, or the rules or regulations that are normally set down to give limitations or boundaries when you're communicating to another person. They are used as rules or laws to govern the use of communication. Basically, the rules are what is communication and what is not communication. So these principles will give you the guidelines. Where are you supposed to put a stop when you're communicating? How are you supposed to communicate to the other person? So it will give you guidelines as well as laws that you're supposed to use when you're communicating to another person. So some of these guidelines or laws include: communication is a package of signals where verbal and nonverbal messages support and reinforce each other. Therefore, the whole package of a message system together to communicate a particular meaning. You have to mix the verbal and non-verbal messages when you're communicating to another person. You have to mix the two for effective communication. So, for example, if just as a person just stand before in front of you and just say words without using any verbal and non-verbal communication, passage of the message will not be effective. The non-verbal normally helps to explain more what you're talking using the words, or what you're what you're communicating using the verbal communication. Then we have communication is a process of adjustment. Not two people use identical signal systems. Therefore, we communicate with each other to the extent that our language system agrees. It is important to learn other people's signals and their meaning so as to improve our communication. You can't just rely on your own knowledge of nonverbal communication usage. You have to learn how other people uses the nonverbal communication for you to be able to agar what you have in order to effectively communicate with other people. So another law is communication involves accommodation and adjustment process, where the sender adjusts or accommodates the receiver style of communication. It explains the second law better, because the way you use some certain nonverbal cues is different from the other person. So you have to accommodate how the other person uses the nonverbal cues for you to be able to communicate to them well. So you have to adjust, or you have to accommodate the receiver style of communication. Example, people with similar speech rate similar speech rate seem to be attracted to each other. So you have to understand what the other person communicate, or how the other person communicate, in order for you to be able to communicate to them better. Because if you have the same way of communication, you'll be able to understand each other better. Unlike when you don't accommodate the other person view of communication, or how they normally use communication. Then the next law is communication involves content and the intentions of message, where the idea behind the message, that is the meaning and its relevance to the sender and the receiver, determines the effectiveness of communication. So the message, or the idea behind the message, what the message need to portray or need to pass across, and the relevance to the audience will determine whether there will be effective communication or not. So you need, as a communicator, you need to make sure that whatever you are communicating to the other person is relevant to them, because once it is not irrelevant, effective communication. For example, you can't communicate a message, for example, a message on family planning to a 5-year-old child, because that information is not relevant to that child. You have to communicate a message, maybe a message on stories, a message on toys, to this child, because it will be relevant. And when it is relevant, it will enhance the effectiveness of the communication. Then communication is a transaction, another law. What is a transaction? A transaction is where you're giving out and you're receiving something else. So you must give a message and you also have to receive a feedback for there to be a communication. So this means that communication is an ever-changing process where nothing is static. This is so because each person is in the communication process is both the sender and the receiver simultaneously. You will send a message, and when the other person is sending their feedback, you become the receiver. So the message sender becomes a receiver during feedback and vice versa, because it's a transaction. Then another rule is that communication is inevitable, irreversible, and unrepeatable. When we say communication is inevitable, communication takes place even when a person communication is inevitable. We mean that sometimes we communicate subconsciously. For example, if someone is looking at you, you may choose to interpret it as a recognition, as a hatred, or even anger. For example, when a child is doing something wrong and you look them in a certain way, they leave doing whatever they are doing because you've already communicated to them that you are not happy with whatever they're doing. There is a way that mothers normally look at their own children and they will communicate. You're not doing what you're supposed to or what you're supposed to be doing. So communication can sometimes be unconscious when you're not conscious, when you're not you're communicating in a way that you're not conscious. You can either be subconscious, you're subconscious. You might not even be out you're communicating, but your body language or you're communicating back to the other person. So this means that communication has taken place. So when we say communication is irreversible, whatever comes out of your mouth, you can't reverse or retrieve it. This may be a reason why the wise people said, weigh your words before you speak, because once you speak, it can never be retrieved or reversed. When we say communication is unrepeatable, communication is ever changing, an ever changing process. Therefore, we cannot recapture the exact situation, frame of mind, and relationship dynamic when repeating a message. Once you pass a message, you can't be able to repeat exactly the same way you communicated before, because messages are unrepeatable. Because the way your mind was, the exact situation, and the relationship dynamic will be totally different when you're repeating the message. So those are the principles under which communication is passed across. Then we have barriers of effective communication. And for there to be effective communication, we must avoid all these barriers, because they will bring about a breakdown of the communication process. This example of these barriers in number one, we have barriers resulting from the source. The source should have a good understanding of the audience and a good understanding of the message. So if the two are not present, or if even one of the two is not present, that's already a barrier to effective communication. Because you not effectively communicate if you don't understand your audience in terms of race, in terms of tribe, in terms of culture, in terms of age, in terms of education background, in terms of the language they're used to use when you're communicating. So if you don't understand those aspects of the audience, you'll not be able to effectively communicate to the audience. So the audience determines the language and style of communication. In order to communicate effectively, you should minimize semantic, internal and external noise. So as the sender, you should try as much as possible not to use language that will disrupt this person, that will make this person angry, disappointed in you. That is semantic noise. You must use a language that will capture the attention of the receiver, thereby minimizing the internal noise. And also, you have to communicate, or you have to use a space or a room where there will be minimal external noise, where there will be good ventilation, there is good air around, there is no interruptions, there are no people around that are walking, there are no noise that is coming from outside or the external noise. So you have to minimize all those types of noise in order for you to be able to also communicate well to your audience. You should also ensure that the setting of for delivery of message is favorable for both the sender and the receiver. And also ensure that there is privacy and comfort for the receiver. I think I've already explained that when I was talking about the noise. So you need to ensure that there is good environment where the communication is taking place in terms of noise, in terms of comfort of the receiver, in terms of the setting for the delivery of the message. So all this is geared towards the overcoming the barrier that result from you as the sender or the source of communication. Another type of communication barrier is barriers affecting the audience. As the sender, you can only minimize the noise. For example, you can only try to capture the attention. But if the audience is not careful, or if the audience is not putting some effort to concentrate, you'll not be able to help the audience to concentrate, or you'll not be able to pass the message to the audience. So noise can only be minimized by the sender, of course, and it is the responsibility of the audience to work on their attitude. You have to work on your attitude as the audience that hinder communication. You have to work on the attitude that includes impatience, that includes negative personality towards the sender, that includes know-it-all of the audience or refusal to listen. Because as the audience, you might find that even if you understand, or even if you are aware of the topic the sender is using or is communicating to you, you might find still new ideas from the sender concerning the topic that you are aware of, because each and every day is a learning process, and communication also is a learning process where you learn something from the sender. So the audience should give time to the sender to express themselves and then become optimistic about the message. So the audience need to give time the sender in order for them to be able to express themselves. And by that, you also need to make sure that you're optimistic and not pessimistic about the message. So they should also allow the sender to inform them, because every day and in everything there is something new to learn. So the audience must also try to transact and accommodate the sender. They must also try to transact and accommodate the sender. They must give the sender their feedback. By that, they are transacting the sender. And also accommodate the sender, however much they look, whether they are tall, whether they are dark, whether they are young, whether they are poor or rich. They have to accommodate the sender in order for them also to be able to understand what the sender have to portray, or the message of the sender. If you concentrate much on the sender attribute or characteristics, you'll not be able to concentrate, and this will be or bring about interference where the message will not be taken home. You have to work on your attitude, be optimistic, accommodate the sender, transact to the sender, and give the sender time to be able to give the message to you. So these are the barriers that we can avoid as audience in order for there to be effective communication. Then another type of barrier is barrier affecting the channel, the method or the medium in which the sender is using to send the message to the receiver. So the sender should choose a channel that is convenient for both the sender and the receiver. For example, if you send an email to a receiver who is in a place that there will be that there is a very poor internet connectivity, the channel is not convenient to the receiver. So you have to use a channel that is very convenient. If you send, for example, a letter through a post office and the person is very far from the post office, that is not convenient. Use a channel that is very convenient to both the sender and the receiver. Then it should be accessible to the receiver. The receiver need to access the channel. It should be very accessible to the receiver. For example, if you choose to use visual aids, you should be able to explain them clearly to the audience. The visual aids here, you need to understand them before even you use to explain to the audience. Because if you don't understand the visual aid, you'll not be able to communicate well to your audience. Then if using a computer or a projector, you should be able to operate the computer as well as the projector. Also, you should use a language that is familiar to the audience. Don't use very ambiguous or very hard words or very difficult words. So if you use ambiguous words, very difficult words, you'll not be able to communicate effectively to the audience. Then the last barrier to effective communication is barriers affecting the feedback, where if a message is not clear, the receiver may fail to understand it. If the receiver fails to understand the message, they may end up interpreting the message wrongly. Noise in the channel may interfere with the feedback. So both the message being sent to you and the feedback you're sending back to the first sender or to your now receiver must be very clear for there to be effective communication. You have to ensure that there is no noise that is interfering with your feedback back to your sender. So that's the process of communication as well as the barrier of the communication process. We can have barriers at the sender level, at the channel level, and also at the feedback level. So in each and every level of communication, identify the barriers to effective communication and try to overcome them with effective communication. So that's all for today. If you have any question that you need clarification, you can use the two contacts that I gave that I've already given you on the portal. The first topic of the portal for any clarification. So I think that will be all for today. Let's meet next week for other lessons.